This is the fifth Sunday in Lent. It's also the last week that we look at the Gospel of John. And one of the interesting things about the Gospel of John is the theory of how it came about being written, being called John. There's a long standing tradition of John being the beloved disciple, but there's not a whole lot of evidence about that in other places. In fact, one of the prevailing theories of the Gospel of John is it was actually written by the school of Mary of Magdalene. That's why we have such an extensive story at the very end of the Gospel of John between Jesus and Mary. And there's decent evidence to suggest that before editors kind of got their hands on anything, that Mary was actually the beloved disciple. And then we have this bit about Peter, which is totally out of place, tacked on to the end. And tradition holds that Mary was the head of the women's church and Peter was the head of the men's church, and they kind of clashed. Peter was a little jealous of Mary being close to Jesus. Now, none of us were there. We can't be sure of anything. But one of the ways we can have an educated guess that women were involved in writing the Gospel of John, or at least their stories were involved, is the fact that there are so many women's stories. If you look at the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, and John, whenever there's a woman involved, often they don't have a name, and the stories are more anecdotal. So it's just one of those things about history that women tend to write stories that include men's stories. Men tend to write men's stories and don't really include women's stories. So the gospel today is definitely a woman's story. And again, we find it in John, which kind of lends credence, of course, to the assumption or the tradition that the school of Mary Magdalene, so her followers, her students, those who would have come after, not necessarily her specifically, but those who look to her for as their leader, their rabbi, their teacher, would have been the authors of this. And the oldest version of the Gospel of John we have dates back to somewhere between 150 to 200, so actually not that long after the Gospel was written itself, around the year 100, which seems a long time ago, but that's right around the time when the Roman legions were populating Hadrian's Wall in Europe, and Germania was having their own problems. So a long time ago, not so much. But this is what we walk into when we're looking at the Gospel of John. And this week specifically, it's another story of Mary and Martha. Now, we met them very briefly in Luke, and I often caution people about assuming that the early church did this. They would recognize a name, and they would assume that that name is the same name being used everywhere else. So if John is used here, then unless there's a specific identity, then John is the John is the John is the John all the way through. We have this trouble with Lazarus. We have this story of Lazarus where he's part of a well-to-do family, and then in the Gospel of Luke, we have another story of Lazarus. And the early church wanted to make these the same people, but the story in Luke, that Lazarus was a beggar who was outside the town, whereas the story in John, he's part of a wealthy family. In fact, his sisters run one of the local house churches in Bethany. So obviously they're not different. They're different. They're not the same people. Now, the reason I say that Mary and Martha are probably the same people that we met in Luke is because in both cases, Martha's the older sister, Mary's named, and they lived in Bethany. So there's more connective tissue, essentially, to who these people are. So we met them first in the Gospel of Luke, and Luke's Gospel was written first, so we're going to give them that priority, where Mary was complaining, or Martha was complaining because Mary wasn't helping her with house church. Somehow that turned into serving in the kitchen, but that's not what the words mean in Greek. So we now are in John. And Martha's still a leader. Their brother Lazarus has died. Usually the brother would have dominion over the house, but Martha apparently was the one that had the say about what often went on. So that was an interesting dynamic in and of itself. Now, the early Christians did recognize more equality between men and women, so that could have been something. Who knows? But Martha and Mary are mourning their brother Lazarus. Word comes to Jesus after he has left Jerusalem. So right before we get into this story, Jesus is in a situation where he's almost stoned to death in the temple. So he takes off for his own safety. When he comes back, with the message that Mary and Martha sent, but Lazarus being sick, come help him, he doesn't get there in time. He dawdles. He takes his time. And Mary challenges him on that. If you'd shown up, our brother wouldn't have died. Mary is kind of emotional about that. Martha is a little bit different. She's definitely the elder sister, and she identifies Jesus as the Messiah. And Jesus assures her, I am the resurrection. All who believe in me will never die. That's a promise. So we have this story of these sisters mourning their brother. Lazarus is brought back to life. Jesus is said to have loved these people. He has wept about their situation, and it's a really sad story to tell. But it's John. It's the Gospel of John. So it's never just the surface story that we're looking at. And it doesn't take too much standing back to realize this is actually foreshadowing Jesus' own death. He's coming into the city under threat of death. He spends time with the people who are important, leading and teaching and spending time with those he loves. And then he is arrested. He does die. 3 days later, he's resurrected. So we have the pattern of Jesus' death and resurrection in the story of Lazarus. So why tell two stories if one will suffice to tell the story of resurrection? Well, I wasn't there, so I can't say for sure, but the story of Lazarus as the foreshadow does something very, very important. It talks about Lazarus getting up and carrying on his life. And that is the promise of resurrection. In the first century of the Hebrew community, those who followed Jesus, those who followed the Pharisees, others, they had very different versions of what resurrection would look like. The Sanhedrin didn't believe at all. They thought dead is dead, you're done. The Pharisees believed in a life after death. They believed in a resurrection, but at the very end of time. So when the world was just about to be over, everybody would be resurrected, and that would be fine. Then there were other people who kind of had different versions of it along the way. Were you resurrected once? Were you resurrected multiple times? Did you come back as a body? Did you come back as something else? What was resurrection for sure, and what did it look like? So these are questions that people were asking. And the writer of the Gospel of John decided to give an image of what one possibility could be like. Someone restored to their family. There's absolutely nothing in John that talks about Lazarus being an important person, not a synagogue leader. He doesn't even talk, doesn't talk about his job, doesn't talk about anything that he actually contributes except that Jesus and his sisters love him. We don't need to be special to see ourselves in this story. Lazarus was loved. Jesus was loved. We are loved. We're no clearer on what resurrection looks like today than we have ever been, because that's to come. And we don't know what that's going to look like. All we can do is speculate. The only thing we got is the promise. And that is what the exchange is between Martha and Jesus. Mary sure gets emotional, and if you'd been here, my brother wouldn't have died, but it's the conversation with Martha in this gospel, much like it was in the Gospel of Luke. Martha is the one who is the person focused on faith development and who probably has the most mature sense of who Jesus is. And she says, I believe in you. I know you're the Messiah. I know you're the one that's promised. It's a profound statement of faith. In the Synoptic Gospels, that statement is given to Peter. See the connection here? A woman does it in the Gospel of John. Kind of like a woman is given the message of resurrection to share. There is something profound in the relationship that Martha recognizes with Jesus. That she is relaxed into the fact that with Jesus there, no matter what happens, it's all good. Mary has very earth-based desires. She wants her brother back, and I'm sure Martha did too. But Martha sees a bigger picture, that the resurrection that Jesus promises is not something that is going to be easily understood, but it is going to be shared by everybody. Jesus is the life. We're given that teaching, we're given that message. All we have to do is have faith in that. And it says in here that worship is part of what happens. The next time we meet this family, we have Mary buying oil and perfume and spreading it all over Jesus' feet and we're rubbing it down with her hair. And Jesus acknowledges it's a type of worship. It's honoring him. It's getting him ready for the death that he's going to deal with. But it is not something that Jesus is scared to face, at least not that we know of. It's something that's part of his ministry. And the message that we're constantly giving is that Jesus is there, that this is all part of what is supposed to happen, that this is how he sees the role that he is to play. John never has people questioning, but not the faithful anyway, the rabbis, the Pharisees, all the time. But John never has the faithful questioning who Jesus is. Jesus is the light. Jesus is the bread of life. Jesus is the resurrection. Jesus is the vine. Jesus is the shepherd. All of those statements in Greek actually start with the language of I am, which is the language that God announced at the burning bush with Moses. For Jesus to say I am, it has the weight and the significance of God announcing God's presence to Moses all those centuries before, millennia before. We can be reassured no matter what happens. It was the outcome that Mary and Martha wanted with Lazarus, but even if that isn't what is realized in each of our lives, it does not take away from the fact that Jesus is the resurrection, that there is something more than death. Death is not the end. And that is the basic statement out of all of this, that we have faith in God, that something more is coming, that there is not a finality with death, that death doesn't win. There is more existence, there is more life. What it looks like, we have no idea. But the promise is solid. And that is the promise we carry with us now as we enter the last weeks of Lent and we move through Holy Week into Good Friday and Easter Sunday, is the promise. We hold on to it. We can imitate what the first century folks did, and it's a good exercise to put ourselves into their place, into what might be going on for them emotionally. But we cannot go completely in because we know how the story continues, and they didn't. The story of Lazarus gives a snapshot of how that story continues for those who might not have been aware of the conversation that Martha and Jesus had, that Jesus is the promise. Following Jesus, that means doing what Jesus asked us to do, not just sitting around and playing like you're Bill and Ted kind of I'm not worthy. That's not the worship kind of thing. Following Jesus is doing as Jesus asked and recognizing that in Jesus, we learn something else about God, something very profound. Jesus is the resurrection, the life, and everything else he claims to be.